one, go.
Hello, everyone, and good evening, and good morning, and also good afternoon, depending where you are. And so this is Henry Huiyao Wang, the founder and president of Center for China Globalization. I'm very pleased to uh, welcome all our friends to tune in to watch our live discussion on international seminar of the 20th anniversary of China's WTO accession and 20 years of China's WTO membership from integration to interaction. So as we celebrate China's 20 years in the WTO, we are convened here to discuss China's evolving role in the WTO and trade cooperation with other and also member states, including the US. And also with recent successful conclusion of the negotiations for the joint statement initiative on service domestic regulation, and also we are rescheduled MC12, which I think hopefully in the near future, we will also explore the prospects of reforms and new development of the WTO in the near future. As the largest multinational economic organization, the WTO modernization has increasingly calls for genuine multinational involvement, and China is also well positioned in reviving such a really a star style that panelists today. Actually, I'm very pleased to welcome so many well-known top international trade experts, and we have actually the three current and former DDJ of WTO. We had also our friends from China and also from Spain on the WTO top experts. So I'd like to introduce them just one by one before our discussion. So the first, I introduce everyone in this alphabetic order. First, I would like to introduce Ms. Anabel Gonzalez. He's the newly elected Deputy Director General of WTO. Congratulations. And she's a renowned expert on trade, investment, and economic development, and held many major positions in the government of Costa Rica, including the Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica, and also has worked in the WTO and World Bank, and also was a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So welcome, Anabel. And also, I'd like to introduce another distinguished lady, Arancha Gonzalez Laya. She's the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, and she's an expert in international trade issues with 20 years of experience and served as the Chief of Staff to the World Trade Organization, Director General Pascalami, and as Executive Director of International Trade Center, and also the Joint Development Agency of the EU and WTO. So our third distinguished guest, Mr. Alan Wolff, is the former Deputy Director General of the WTO and currently as a distinguished visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. He has conducted extensive research on developing reforms of WTO, responding to the roles of the US, the EU, and China, and in many international trading system. And he is also the founder of the Trade for Peace initiative, which is joins the WTO and also international financial institutions and the peace community in the efforts to provide assistance to fragile and conflict-affected countries. So also Alan has spoke here at the CCG 2 years ago when I come to Beijing to meet Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, and with all these 5 international institution meeting with Chinese government. Now I'd like to introduce my very dear colleague and also the former Vice Minister of Ministry of Commerce, Mr. Yi Xiaozhun. He is also the former Deputy Director General at the WTO, former Chinese ambassador to the WTO, and also currently he's the General Counsel of the Network of International Trade and Investment System in Beijing. That's Minister Yi's new networks now. Besides his contribution to the China's WTO accession, he played a leading role in negotiating numerous free trade agreements, including China-ASEAN Agreement, China first FTA, and also many other achievements. I myself used to work in Ministry of Commerce many years ago, so I'm very honored to have a colleague like Minister Yi. But also I would like to introduce another distinguished lady, also a former colleague of MOFCOM, Madame Zhang Yuejiao. She's the former chairperson of the WTO appellate body as the first Chinese national appointed to that position. And also she's the dean of the Institute for International Dispute Settlement, Tsinghua University. She helped Minister of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation and was one of China's chief negotiators on intellectual property. And she has also served as chief legal counsel for China's GATT resumption and WTO accession. So today is really fascinating. We were having such a great lineup of speakers and great panelists for discussion. So we know that this is actually, this few days is the timing of China joining WTO for the past 20 years, and great changes have taken place both in China and internationally on the trade and international economic development. So perhaps I would like to maybe start with Minister Yi, and since you're not too long ago coming back from WTO, and you have so many colleagues here, and if we talk about China joining WTO, you probably the best person to start. Maybe Minister Yi, you first, please.
Thank you very much, Huiyao, for your invitation. And I'm so excited to join my old friends and former colleagues for this important event. As you know that after lengthy and tough negotiations, China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001, which is widely considered as the WTO accession marked a migration to the world economy. China's trade opening, as well as global economic integration and multilateral trade rules, worked together to facilitate China gaining extraordinary economic and trade growth. In return, China has proved to become an indispensable engine for the global growth. And its WTO membership has also made the WTO a truly global and more relevant international organization. China's successful accession has also inspired many other developing countries to join the WTO. As DG Iwela of the WTO stated a couple of days ago in Geneva, China has become the textbook case for how global trade integration can drive growth and development. The country's economic rise has lifted millions out of poverty, not only within China, but also in China's trading partners across the developing world. China's WTO accession created a win-win outcome. For all the attention given to China's rise as an export powerhouse, people have focused much less on the question of China's imports. From $244 billion in 2001, merchandise imports into China jumped to $2.06 trillion last year, or 12% of world merchandise trade. This is a significant contribution to the world economy, which is too often overlooked. In order to better understand the economic implication of China's accession, we need only to look at China's rank and share in the exports of major economies over time. For example, China went from being the 11th largest export destination of the US in 2001, accounting for less than 2% of US exports, to being the country's third largest export partner, absorbing 9% of US exports. Among developing countries, South Africa is a representative example. China was the country's #1 export destination in 2020, up from the 17th place in 2001. During this period, the share of China in South Africa's exports jumped from 1.7% to 11%. China is even more important for other emerging economies, including Brazil, where nearly 32% of exports go to China. Upon its WTO accession, China's economy has undergone a systemic transformation, an all-round opening up. The past 20 years have proven that by embracing globalization and integrating into world economy, China has successfully become a global manufacturing hub and a trade center. A wide range of Chinese industries, particularly those that were opened up due to China's WTO commitment, have emerged much stronger in global competition and climbed up the value chain. Keeping the same pace is therefore a strategic choice for China to enhance its international positioning and avoid falling into the middle income trap in next decades. The less known reason for China's success in speedy development and industrial upgrading after its WTO accession is its proactive participation in global value chains. It's convinced that continuous trade and investment liberalization in the future will improve the business environment, attract foreign investment, and help China remain firmly embedded in global value chains. It, in return, will greatly reinforce its economic resilience to withstand various crises and risks and break the ill-founded decoupling argument. At present, the multilateral trading system is going through the most difficult moment in its more than 70 years of history. Trade protectionism is spreading around WTO nations and paralyzed dispute settlement mechanism. However, an open, non-discriminatory and rules-based multilateral trading system that can keep pace with modern times is indispensable for the growth of both China and the world economy. In a multipolar world, China should promote a new pattern of collective leadership and good co-governance in the WTO. Therefore, China is needed to provide more public goods to WTO members by opening up its market and promote win-win multilateral cooperation. China is also expected to stay firm in observing multilateral trade rules so as to gain the trust of the members. Regarding the ongoing WTO reform, China should actively participate in the process and firmly uphold open, inclusive, and non-discriminatory principles, while preventing the multilateral trading system from moving toward protectionism. In conclusion, while China's huge achievement during 20 years of WTO membership are to be commended, the country must not rest on its successes. Our task now is to find a way to restore multilateral cooperation, keep strengthening the system, and deliver new reforms. In an increasingly interdependent and multipolar world economy, it is our shared responsibility to ensure that we foster global economic cooperation and that we leave a strong and well-functioning trading system for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yi. And So you have really started a very good opening discussion. I think that China's accession to the WTO for the last 20 years has actually, we see the China's import from the world has gone up six times. Of course, China's export to the world has gone up 7 times. But I think, that China has really contributed to the trade boom and prosperity of the world. So thank you, Minister Yi. I think, probably talking about WTO, we cannot find a better person to talk than Minister Anabel Gonzalez. Yeah, so you are the DDG of WTO. You're on top of WTO. You're currently looking after WTO. So perhaps you could share your view on this topic as well. So Anabel, your floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Huiyao. It's a real pleasure to join this important event. And I would like to thank you and your co-organizers for the kind invitation and also for bringing me with this great panelist to mark the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO. Today, I would like to look at China's WTO accession through the prism of the past, the present, and the future. Starting with the past, China's accession to the WTO was a defining moment for China, for its trading partners, and for the WTO as well. It took 15 years of hard work and dedication from the start of China's accession process to its completion. When China finally became the 143rd WTO member in December 2001, the WTO took a big step in the direction of universal membership. The accession of China, with 1/5 of the world's population at the time, helped put the letter W in WTO, bringing the organization one step closer to truly world organization. And the strength and credibility of the WTO was improved with just over 6 years old at the time. China's accession also raised awareness of the WTO and its fundamental principles of transparency, non-discrimination, and cooperation, both in China and around the world. With China joining the organization, you saw many more government officials, business leaders, academics, and civil society representatives in China, but also across countries, paying much closer attention to the world global trading system, its rules, negotiations, disputes, and even sometimes even its day-to-day work in Geneva. In short, China's WTO accession was a big plus for the WTO. And it was, of course, also a big plus for China. Accession negotiations resulted in 44 bilateral market access agreements and over 750 pages of legal text. The commitments enshrined in those instruments provided an institutional anchor to the wide-ranging process of opening up, reforms, and liberalization that China started in the late 1970s. WTO accession also served as an accelerator of China's market-oriented reforms. In the run-up to its accession, China revised and updated a large number of laws that broadened market access opportunities, streamlined the trade regime, and created a more attractive investment environment. To take just one measure, China's average applied MFN tariff has decreased from 15.6% in 2001, just before China acceded to the WTO, to 9.5% in 2011. Since then, China has unilaterally reduced tariffs on a wide range of products, bringing down its average applied rate to around 7%. The remarkable transformation of the Chinese economy turbocharged a new era of globalization, with China as a trade powerhouse and a major hub for global value chains. Between 2001 and 2020, China's merchandise exports and imports increased more than ninefold. From being the world's sixth largest goods exporter and importer in 2001, China is now the largest exporter and the second largest importer. China is also a major global presence in commercial trade, services trade, both as an importer and as an exporter, as well as a leading recipient and a major source of foreign direct investment. China's WTO membership has become emblematic of how how integration into the global trading system can drive rapid catch-up growth and development. In 2001, China's GDP was $1.3 trillion. By 2020, it had increased by a factor of 11 to $14.7 trillion. Meanwhile, China's poverty levels stumbled from almost half the population to less than 1%, and the country's middle class expanded. And this is a fantastic success story. And it is also a cause for celebration, and the Chinese people should be commended for it. And the WTO members should be proud of the success story. Now, the gains from China WTO accession have extended far and wide beyond China's borders. For consumers, imports from China meant lower prices. For producers, China integration into the global economy meant new opportunities to join global value chains and access China's huge domestic market. So China is a top trading partner. We've heard of a number of economies worldwide and a major trading partner of countless others. And all of them have gained from the policy stability and predictability that came with China's accession to the WTO. Now, today, China is an active player, confident and influential at the WTO. Its support to developing and least developed countries is particularly appreciated, from the preferential tariff treatment that China gives to LDCs, to its ongoing participation in the Aid for Trade initiative, to its overall engagement in South-South cooperation. And yet, one cannot overlook that China's 20th anniversary at the WTO coincides with rising pressures on the organization and the rules-based trading system. The WTO rulebook has not kept pace with the profound changes that are reshaping global trade. The WTO's dispute settlement system is paralyzed, and trade tensions have flared up in recent years, increasing the risk of fragmentation and increased policy uncertainty. We must urgently change course and revitalize trade and the WTO. And that calls for a relentless pursuit of additional trade reforms, because the work to reform trade remains unfinished, both in China and elsewhere. China's trade policy review, held last October in Geneva, highlighted several areas in need of attention. For example, many members expressed concern about the lack of transparency regarding China's state measures, not least what they perceive to be a generally opaque subsidy regime and the lack of timely notifications on key issues such as state trading enterprises and domestic support. Given the importance of SOEs in China's economy, many members also expressed concerns about the increased support to them and the distortions they create. Other issues of concern raised by members during China's review included the protection of intellectual property rights, laws, and regulations related to cybersecurity and data management, and China's SPS regime. Members also encouraged China to further streamline administrative measures for foreign investors and relax remaining restrictions on foreign participation. I encourage China to carefully consider these issues as it continues the process of opening up to the world economy. And I equally encourage China's trading partners to consider any concerns that China has raised about their own trade and investment regimes. It is only by listening to each other in good faith, not talking past each other, that we will be able to advance the urgent task of revitalizing trade and the WTO. And let me now quickly say a word on China's accession to the WTO from the prism of the future. Cooperation at the WTO offers China and its trading partners many win-win opportunities to accelerate and deepen trade reform. The recent outcome on services domestic regulation is a good example of what is possible when WTO members work together to come up with meaningful, pragmatic, and common sense solutions to real-world problems. Just 2 weeks ago, 67 WTO members announced the successful conclusion of negotiations on disciplines that set a gold standard for services regulation. And China played a key role in bringing these negotiations to a successful conclusion. And we can talk more about the implication of this work. China has also been a driving force behind the WTO's work on investment facilitation, which brings together over 110 WTO members from all corners of the world, all sizes, all levels of development, to negotiate disciplines that will make it easier for investors to invest. And all are committed to wrap up negotiations within a year. Most recently, China also worked closely with Fiji to launch negotiations, to launch a discussion at the WTO on plastics trade. Again, another important topic. And in a welcome step, China recently decided to join a group of 60-odd WTO members doing focused work in areas such as trade and climate change and the promotion of trade in climate-friendly goods, services, and technologies. China is also an active participant in the Multilateral Initiative on Digital Trade. And while the new Omicron variant forced us to postpone our 12th ministerial conference 2 weeks ago, negotiations have continued, and China has been at the heart of the efforts to bridge outstanding gaps to deliver results on pandemic response, including intellectual property and fisheries subsidies. So we need to see in these areas, and I probably would like to say just a word on fisheries negotiations to say that in recent months we have seen some forward movement in these areas, helped in no small measure by the engagement from key participants, including China, which has flagged that it would not seek special and differential treatment in these negotiations. And we need to see more of this flexibility from China and from all other key players if we want to deliver results and lay the foundation for WTO reform. That's why I'm deeply heartened by China's strong commitment to the multilateral trading system, as expressed at the fourth China International Import-Export by President Xi, who also indicated that China would take an open and active attitude in negotiations on issues as critical as the digital economy, trade and the environment, industrial subsidies, and state-owned enterprises. Let me conclude by reiterating that China's accession to the WTO 20 years ago has been a big plus for China, for the WTO, and for countless other economies around the world. And as one of the world's largest traders and a key stakeholder in the rules-based trading system, China has a key responsibility to work with others to put the WTO on the track to meaningful reform. I believe that China is ready to evolve from rule taker to rule maker at the global level. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anabel. It's really a great speech. I think you highlight the achievement of WTO, of China, joint WTO, its contribution to the world, to China, and also the future reform of WTO, of course, and also all those low-hanging fruit that we are harvesting right now. We hope we continue to harvest more, and absolutely. You have summarized so well. I think this is really great to know what we have achieved, what we have done so far, and what we can aim for the future. So thank you again. Now I'd like to invite Arancha, Gonzalez, Laya. You are an old expert, old hand. You are not very old, but you are old hand on the WTO. And you've been the chief of staff, and you were also witness of China joined WTO for a long time. So now you're also the former foreign minister of Spain. So you have a much larger area to look after in addition to the trade. So what's your view on China joining WTO for the last 20 years, and how do you look at the past 20 years, and what's the future lies ahead? So for your floor, please, Arancha, please.
Well, thank you very, very much for this invitation to celebrate the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO. If this was a wedding anniversary, and I think in a way China becoming a member of the World Trade Organization was some sort of wedding, and I think that by now I would argue that those that participated in the wedding are no longer newlywed after 20 years. But if this was a wedding anniversary, the 20th wedding anniversary is the porcelain anniversary. Now, China knows porcelain very well because China invented it. And porcelain, we know, is both strong and delicate. And I think this anniversary is a good image of where we are today, 20 years later. Let me outline where I think the strength part is. I think the WTO is stronger as a result of China becoming a member of the organization. We've heard this. Um, with China representing 1/5 of the world, you cannot claim that the WTO is really global, is really world, if China is not in it. So it gave the WTO a big legitimacy push when it became a member. I think accession also made the WTO stronger in that the insertion of China into the global economy happened within a framework of rules. And this generated predictability, as opposed to having the insertion of China follow just simply the laws of the jungle, where, it's all about the survival of the strongest. It laid a framework that gave predictability, and this was good for the WTO. It also made China stronger. It helped the Chinese leadership manage this enormous transformation of its economy that ultimately resulted in the eradication of extreme poverty. This is an incredible achievement by all standards. I also think that WTO accession made the rest of the world stronger. It provided businesses with trade and investment opportunities around the world. It gave consumers choice and access to products and services like never before. But above all, it ensured that China would be seated at the table to manage in a co-responsible manner the growing interdependence that we have seen in these last 20 years, whether it's in the area of trade, whether it's in the area of finance or on climate change. The name of the game is growing interdependence. But if we are to be fair, I think we also have to recognize that 20 years later, there are fragilities that need to be addressed if this porcelain that is the WTO is to keep providing this strong insurance policy. I want to focus on three concrete fragilities that we need to address, that the world needs to address together. The first one comes from the impact that this large insertion of China into the global economy has had, the impact that it has had on Chinese business and on Chinese citizens and workers, but also the impact that it also has had on on businesses, workers around the world in other countries. It's difficult to dissociate the impact of China from the impact of other transformations that have happened in these 20 years, and most notably, the big technological transformation. It's difficult to disentangle the two, but it's fair to say that there's been winners and there's also been losers. And what we have learned from this fragility, from the fragility of the losers, is that countries need to strengthen social safety nets if we are to keep alive the idea of continuous trade and investment openings. The second fragility comes from the WTO rulebook itself. It needs a serious reform if the WTO is to adapt to the big changes that have happened since China became a WTO member, but also from the big change that is that China today is a systemic actor. So what China does or what China does not do has a very clear impact, a substantial impact on the rest of the world. Now, we know, we've heard this from previous speakers, we know that the rules of the WTO on public subsidies, whether these are on agriculture, on industry, on services. We know that rules on state trading enterprises. We know that rules on the digital economy. We know that rules on market access need a serious update. And I think that here, China should not just engage in this conversation. I think it's important that China co-leads this discussion. This discussion is not about economic changes in economic systems. It's not economic system change. It's about rules of the game that will guarantee fairness, that will guarantee predictability, and that will guarantee transparency to trade exchanges. It's about making sure that there is a level playing field. And again, I think there is a bigger space here for China that is now a big systemic actor to be leading with others, obviously with other big trading nations, with it's the United States and the European Union, and with others around the world, this reform. The third fragility comes from their belief that unilateral policies, that inward-looking plans, that unfair practices, or even disengagement from the system will protect and will provide an economic and even a geopolitical advantage. And here, I think we need to be very lucid. The reality is that in an interdependent world, the most effective avenue to protect the only means to provide for win-win outcomes is the avenue of multilateral cooperation, multilateral engagement. And I want to stress this because I think this has to be central to looking into the future to ensure that we continue strengthening by dealing with the fragilities that the trading system has. So congratulations, China, on the 20th anniversary of becoming a member of the WTO. And not, I mean, I very much look forward to more engagement from China, not just in the next 20 years, but first starting with the next 20 months that will be essential to whether or not we are capable of reshaping the global trading system and its future. Thank you again, Xie, and looking forward to continuing in this dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Arancha. Yeah, excellent point. And you also, summarize well the China's, accession to WTO. What has the impact it has made? What is the positive? What are the fragile things that you think in the future we can look into again? And so those are really very stimulating ideas, and also your idea of how we can working for the next 20 months to really save WTO and really promote WTO, and couldn't be the better time. I think also particularly with the pandemic complication on that. So we really need to work together. That's why we're having four, 3 or 4 WTO current past officials sitting here representing different regions of the world to talk about this issue. Now, I'd like to maybe invite Alan. Alan, you are the old trade expert. I mean, you and Minister Yi just accomplished your terms at the WTO as a DGJ, and you have a vast experience. And of course, you're coming from a very large trade nation as well, United States of America. So you've been to China, you've been looking at the issues. How do you think of the WTO accession for China in 20 years has made, the benefit to both China and the world, and also to the extent, and U.S. actually supported China join WTO, and so I think it's also brought many advantages to not only China but also U.S. and multinationals are now all in China, very active, and also for the rest of the world. So perhaps Alan, you can give your perspective on China's 20 years into WTO. Alan, your floor, please.
Thank you very much, Huiyao, and it's good to be with former colleagues and great experts on the WTO and on China's participation in it. Arguably, I'd say the action by the WTO to bring China into the system was the most important action it took in its 26-year history. And you could also argue that the accession of China to the WTO was one of the most important steps that China took in its economic interrelations with the rest of the world. While all the 164 members of the WTO benefit substantially and have benefited substantially from the WTO, I'd say that China was second to none in terms of the benefits it achieved. As been said by my colleagues on the panel, hundreds of millions of Chinese came out of poverty. The lives of China's people have greatly enhanced. But this is not the end of history. It's an unfinished story. The expectation of China's trading partners in 2001 was that China would continue its integration with other economies in the global economy. The purpose of the WTO is a shared commitment to ever greater openness of trade on fair terms, free of distortions. It's about convergence based on this ideal. By joining the WTO, China pledged that commercial enterprises, whether or not state-owned, must act solely on the basis of commercial considerations, buying and selling decisions free from government interference or influence, and that market-oriented behavior is expected of all, not just China, all WTO members. The WTO rules should make this basic tenet, I think, explicit, should be adopted. China has said that in any new trade agreement will take on responsibilities in line with its capacity. That's extraordinarily important, a praiseworthy commitment. Acting in accordance with it will increase trust in the trading system. The G20 leaders have repeatedly called for WTO reform. As the world's second largest economy, largest exporter of goods, China has the resources, including expertise in the WTO, which is demonstrated this morning on this panel, to take a positive leadership role, as Arancha just said, in tandem with others to bring about necessary reforms. So what are the reforms that are necessary? Serious negotiations are needed, first, to yield new agreements liberalizing trade further and extending the rules of the system. We saw that with domestic regulation of services. Second, to restore dispute settlement seen as legitimate by all. And third, to develop the WTO as an institution with an executive secretariat to be more effective as an administrator of the trading system. A necessary early topic for expansion of the scope of the system's rules is crafting disciplines over industrial subsidies, as has been mentioned by prior speakers. It's unlikely that dispute settlement reform can be achieved without disciplines on industrial subsidies. Failure to address this subject will result in continuing trade conflicts. China will be both the recipient of complaints and a complainant with respect to the conduct of others. Areas of potential conflict should be reduced by providing clear international disciplines on both industrial and agricultural subsidies. 1 month ago, as we mentioned, speaking at the China International Import Expo in Shanghai, President Xi Jinping said that China is open to negotiations on industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises in order to be accepted into the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The issues involved should be resolved also on a multilateral basis, not just on a regional basis. China has been in the forefront of joint statement initiatives, as has been mentioned, in plurilateral negotiations, facilitation of investment for development, domestic regulation of services, the e-commerce discussions. China now should join with other participants in those joint initiatives to assure that the outcomes of the negotiations are included as a formal matter as part of the WTO's fully acknowledged agreements. They have to be regularized. They have to be brought into the WTO and accepted. China was and is essential to deal with COVID-19 and future pandemics. The WTO's members have yet to act collectively to set rules to which this and future pandemics can be dealt with more effectively in the trading system. It's imperative that that take place. China can also make an important contribution by joining the pharmaceutical agreement for duty-free trade in pharmaceuticals, as it's a major player in that area. and by updating the product coverage of the Information Technology Agreement, including goods that are pandemic related, IT products. Trade will play an essential role in dealing with climate change, bringing foodstuffs from areas of plenty to areas of need, and bringing environmental goods from distant factories to places where they must be deployed. China has suggested, the officials of China have suggested that the Environmental Goods Agreement be brought back, the negotiations be brought back. That should take place. Chinese officials will have to deal, as we all will, with carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This should be an area that's subject to multilateral rules rather than imposed unilaterally or solved bilaterally if that were possible. It's really a challenge that's upcoming for the trading system. And there will be conflict if there's not mutual agreement at a multilateral level. China is an essential party to each of the subjects I've just mentioned. And beyond those challenges of global health and climate, of course, there are geopolitical strains in international relations that can threaten trade, have been threatening trade. Trade becomes weaponized. Active management is required. The multilateral trading system was founded in the middle of the last century to underwrite and sustain peace. Pascal Lamy spoke to this issue, by the way, on a webinar on Friday. It was really very eloquent on the subject. The WTO can and should play a positive role in achieving this objective of maintaining peace in the face of current challenges. It should not be an issue that's shirked. China should move to a more active role in making the WTO succeed. That's been said, that it should take a leading role. I agree with that. It should join with the United States, the European Union, Japan, others, a few like-minded countries to preserve and improve the WTO by leading the reform effort. Under the GATT and the WTO, the economies of the world have become increasingly interdependent. This should be a cause for celebration and not fear. Strenuous efforts will be needed to keep global economic integration as a positive development, bringing about shared economic growth and sustaining peaceful relations. The world, of course, is very different than it was 20 years ago. The WTO is now in crisis. It's not in China's interest or in the interest of other members that it fail. The key anniversary for China in the WTO, I think, is not this one. It's the China at 25, the 25th anniversary mark. I don't know whether that's probably not porcelain, and Arancha may know what it is, but I don't. Looking back from the 25th anniversary, the question will be, what has China done to sustain the multilateral trading system during these next 5 years? At events marking China at the WTO at 25, those speaking on panels like this one, I assume CCG will have such a panel, will be able to evaluate what President Xi Jinping meant when he said at the Shanghai Expo, "We support the WTO reform in moving in the right direction. We will not change our resolve," I'm quoting for Xi Jinping, "will not change our resolve to open wider at a high standard. We will not change our determination to share development opportunities with the rest of the world, and we will not change our commitment to an economic globalization that's more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial for all." I look forward to that panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. Yeah, you mentioned a lot of points as well. I think that you also agreed that the China's accession to the WTO is really a right thing for the WTO and for the world. So that's great to hear. But also, we have so many things that we need to look forward. You talk about reform. You talk about all those initiatives. I think that probably we'll have more discussion on that. So really, thank you for your comment here, which is very stimulating as well. Now, last but not least, I would like to have Huiyao, my former colleague, but also a top legal expert at the WTO and the rule and transparency and development. Huiyao, you've been so long in the WTO field and also at the ADB and all the other international institutions and at MOFCON, of course. Now at Tsinghua now. So what do you see? 20 years of section, what has improved for China and of course to the world? I mean, since China joined WTO, we abolished over 200,000 from both central and local government outdated regulations and laws and things like that. You probably contribute a leadership to that as well. So why not you share some of your perspective? Huiyao, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join such a distinguished panel. Particularly, I'm very pleased to meet and talk to former colleagues in Geneva. So I appreciate it very much. First, congratulations. We have the first Lady DG and Lady DDG. So congratulations. And I'm also very pleased to see Arancha. We have been celebrating the 10th anniversary in Shanghai together with the DG Laya. And also talk to so much to Alan. Yeah. Great expert on the WTO and also international trade and broader issues. So you brought to the WTO. Appreciate it very much. Now I would like to add a few points in the legal field. Since China's accession to the WTO, I think very remarkable achievements have been done, particularly in the field of opening up and the rule of law, both domestically and internationally. I would like to first mention in the unconditional MFN, the most favored nation treatment, non-discrimination, the milestone provision of the WTO, and it's also improved the relationship between China and other international counterparts, particularly the U.S.-China established the normal trade relations. That's very important for non-discriminatory treatment. And I see also the recent active negotiations and conclusions on the service domestic regulation. It's a remarkable achievement because the big players, EU, the US, and China, can reach an agreement and lead the other 57 members. Encourage people to pursue more reforms in the years and the time to come. In terms of opening up, China's contribution, particularly China still undertaking very strict boundaries, lower than other partners, other members of the WTO. And China has lowered down its tariff from, in the past, 50%, some sectors even 80%, down to now only 7.4%, much lower than the average of developing countries, 15%. It's also lower than its initial commitment, 9.2%. By opening up, foreign consumers and business people, they get more opportunities to come in, and also Chinese consumers, they can purchase cheaper goods from abroad. In the field of rule of law, very significant. China has liberalized its trading system, abolished the trading rights. Now everybody can do foreign trade, including foreigners and joint ventures. As the previous speakers mentioned, it's a great contribution of China to the WTO, making the WTO more representative in the world, 1/5 of the world population. And China has abolished, since its accession to the WTO, 2,400 rules and laws and regulations, and 190,000 local regulations. It's a really significant progress in the rule of law in China. the transparency, making the business environment much better than before. Since I returned back, I can see my friends from joint venture, they also happy with the current because the environment is so easier than before. They can get rules and laws, regulations. It's just even they said that it's much faster than they could get a home at their own country. So that is significant. And they are continuing to do so because recently they have abolished and they also established new rules, very strict. Ask the governmental agencies to make a one-shop business operations. It means in the old days, they need to take 1 week, even 1 month to register their business. Now just in few hours. So the online digital economy, they are very helpful. Even in the port system, I would like to invite you to visit the Chinese port, from the local ports to the Supreme People's Port. If you just touch the button, you can see the hearings at any place of China. So openness, transparency is very, very important, not only for foreigners to facilitate foreign investment, but also for domestic people. And I would like to aid also the intellectual property rights. I have at Tsinghua University, I'm still teaching as a chair professor intellectual property. You all know that in the last 30 years, I concentrate my time for intellectual property. I'm very confident to say now China's intellectual property rights protection, including patents, copyrights, and trademarks, already exceeding TRIPS requirements. So even they are still improving the enforcement after the talk between China and the US, and also after the negotiations between China and the EU on the trademarks. So I think local people and international experts, they're all happy with the current improvement, upgrading. And China has already established local courts and the Supreme People's Court intellectual property tribunal. So that's the foreigners, they are very happy. They said that at home, they do not have such convenience, such level of protection. And I would like to aid also in terms of dispute settlement. Peaceful solution of dispute is one of the principles of international law and United Nations charters. And China participated actively in all the dispute settlement in the WTO as complainant. China brought 22 cases. As respondent, China also argued and joined 47 cases. As a third party, China joined 190 cases. I think that not only for the clarification of the provisions of the covered agreements, but also to train, to upgrade the skills and the knowledge of international law and WTO rules. And particularly, I would mention that China's enforcement of WTO dispute settlement decisions is perfect. As former DG Lamy said, is A+. From the appellate body, I witnessed by myself and my former colleagues that China has enforced all those decisions. Even for the case of intellectual property copyrights, China has amended through the People's Congress, the highest legislative body of China, is a copyright law, Article 4, based on the panel report decision. So it's unprecedented in China, the rule of law history. Even in the world, so in the legal circle, highly appreciated by other people, honored its international commitment, pacta sunt servanda. In concluding my remarks, I would like to call that the resumption of the appellate body should be as soon as possible. It's really very bad and also against the DSU prompt and positive solution of disputes is the central element for the security and predictability of the multilateral trading system. But now there are already more than 15 appeal cases, but the appellate body is functioning. So we need to resume its function and meanwhile to pursue its reform. For instance, the report's too long and the time too long. So overall, I think those issues through DSP, through joint efforts of all members, 164 members, work together, I'm confident they can overcome those mostly technical issues. I think for the dispute settlement, it's a public good, as I mentioned at Harvard University, and also appreciated by my colleagues there, that the dispute settlement should be correct and concise, clear, and conclusions of fairness and justice. And they should be also coherent and consistent. This award should be enforced. That should be a good dispute settlement, make the system more efficient. So, and all people involved in the dispute settlement, they should observe a very strict code of conduct, independent and impartiality, to ensure that the WTO dispute settlement still the crown jewel, the best part and the function, the best, highly appreciated by people, should be resumed. And I should say objectively assessment that the WTO dispute settlement, in terms of the level of participation, in terms of the average time of conclusion of a case, in terms of the burdens, I think that compared to ICJ or to ICSID, the WTO is doing well. And maintaining the two-tiers system to have a correction of legal errors is very important. Even Ancestral Working Group 3, they have made a conclusion that for this dispute involve a government or sovereignty, they need an appeal system to correct legal errors for the first instances and arbitral tribunals decisions. So I'm confident that with so many capable men and women in the WTO, particularly with 164 members, this is a member-driven institution. So if we work together with a political will and join hands in hands, I think that we can keep the momentum as we prepare for the MC12. Unfortunately, it's postponed. But for those outstanding issues, we can overcome. I hope that during my next time to revisit the WTO, the alphabetic can functioning well, smoothly. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Huiyao, and a fascinating discussion. I think we talk about, you give a more expert talk on legal, what China has done, has achieved, and abolish all those unfit laws and regulations to connecting the world into global standards. That has really done so well. So now we have finished the opening section. Now we get into the discussion second part of our panel. So I think now we can have some further discussion. I really agree at opening remark, and we mentioned that WTO and trade is really a great peace stabilizer. I mean, after Second World War, we had the Bretton Woods system, we had the World Bank, IMF, WTO, GATT, WTO. I mean, really driven the world for the next 76 years. And now, at that time, when WTO was set up, GATT was launched, the world is only about 2.5 billion people. Now it's 7.8 billion. So the world has really grown out of its original size and shape. And so how we can really continue to make trade, prosperity, a peacemaker to really, to hedge on the geopolitical tension, as Alan also mentioned. But so how can we do that, and how can we really stabilize? Now we have the 5, tonight and this morning, 5 current and former senior WTO officials on the same panel. I mean, we have a representative from US, from EU, from China, from developing countries, all aspects. So it's really a great occasion for us to talk further. How can we really continue to reform WTO? What are the low-hanging fruit where we can get further progress? How can China, US, EU, and all the other countries, 164 members, working together? So I'm thinking, loudly here, and maybe that's where we can discuss in the next phase of this round. But also, we know that MC12 is still upcoming, but we don't know when, but certainly going to come in. But how we can really achieve progress, like we did on the service trade, did on the plastic trade, on the investment liberalization and facilitation. Maybe we could push for digital. We could push for other areas, and so how can we further do that? And also, we know that the G20 has proposed a global corporate minimum tax, where all the big multinational has to pay 15% no matter where they do business. That's probably a great idea. So how can WTO avoid this widening gap in some developed countries? 1% of the top wealthy is equal to 40-50 of mass population. And China is often become the scapegoat for things, domestic policies. So those are really interesting issues. And so perhaps on that, we'll start again. We will have Minister Yi to have some second round. We also have Professor Tu, the Dean of the WTO Institute of University of International Business and Economics, with us tonight. I mean, you will be later on comment on our discussion as well. So Minister Yi, maybe you can start again. We have a second round of, also reflect on what we have talked so far, and how do we continue the WTO reform. Mr. Yi, please.
Well, thank you, and I'm very pleased to hear the comments by my friends and colleagues, and I'm extremely happy to hear the comments from Arancha. You mentioned that China's accession is a kind of wedding. My big question is how long this honeymoon can last. And we already hear some noise that maybe it's time to divorce. I hope it will not happen, but at least we can hear some noise. And to me, I think the biggest challenge is nowadays, there's no trust in the organization. That's the key reason for for the difficulty to have any multilateral cooperation. And then I also heard that Arancha mentioned twice or even more times about a win-win approach. I think that's the key to resume multilateral cooperation, to deliver new agreements. But how can we resume that spirit? If you continue to stick to a zero-sum approach, then it's hopeless to see any new agreements. And for China, my reading is that China is more than willing to cooperate on any positive multilateral agenda. I checked that in the past, if you check a Chinese record in the WTO, China participated in all positive issues in the WTO, including ITA expansion, trade facilitation agreement, environmental goods agreement negotiations, fish negotiations, GPA negotiations, and all joint initiatives. I think that shows that China is willing to advance the WTO on any issue which has a potential to deliver. But meanwhile, can we assume that we will see a good willingness from other parties to cooperate? That's my biggest question.
Great, thank you, Ms. Li. Yeah, I think my impressions are from this discussion, the current discussion. We have 5 panelists, which has been very eloquent and convincing. That we need to strengthen WTO. We need to have a not only have a 20 years wedding, we're going to have a silver wedding, maybe 25 years or even 50 years gold wedding. we need to all country needs to be innovative, actively pursue that. So I think we have this consensus. Basically, we are here that people all felt WTO needs to be pushed forward for reform, and also, I mean, we are now also facing pandemic. Maybe I don't know the patent of pandemic sharing, those. Vaccine patent, things like that. How WTO can help country get out of the pandemic and trade issues. So we hear so many good recommendations and suggestions. And then for CCG, we've been a think tank for pro-trade, pro-liberalization, and pro-facilitation of investment, and we'd love to really push forward. And now we see also the regional trade liberalization going on. January 1st, RCEP will be really kicked off, getting in effect, and China has applied with CPTPP. And this morning I had a dialogue in this office with ambassador from Mexico, from Chile, from Colombia, from Peru, and 3 of them are TPP members. They all welcome China to join TPP. So what I'm just saying, maybe on the WTO, which is the biggest trade multilateral system, the backbone of the global trading for the last 7 decades. So how can we continue to strengthen that and reform that and really build peace and avoid the geopolitical conflict? So perhaps, Anabel, you are the current WTO leaders, and perhaps also you are from developing countries, and you can give your perspective as well. Again, we're in this round. Anabel, please.
Thank you very much. It's been indeed a very, very rich and interesting conversation. I would maybe like to say, in terms of the way forward, that there is a concerted effort that is needed to reform the way in which the WTO works. And that, encompasses the way in which negotiations take place, where multilateral negotiations are important, but of course, plurilateral negotiations are also a very important format to deliver. And we've seen here a very active engagement on the part of China. We also, of course, need to address the issue of dispute settlement, which has been mentioned by a number of the participants, because for the WTO, having a legally binding dispute settlement system is absolutely critical to implement and enforce the rules that are agreed. But in addition to, making this concerted effort to reform the institutional framework of the WTO, it's also important to look at the rule book of the WTO, and I think we're doing that. And there needs to be we need to continue to harvest that which can be harvested. And you mentioned the example of services domestic regulation. I think that would be the case in the area of investment facilitation. I'm also very hopeful, for instance, for the discussions on trade and environment in the different formats in which they are beginning right now. And then again, I see clear engagement on the part of China. There are also some other critical areas. I mentioned that a number of members have expressed the importance of developing strengthened rules in the areas of subsidies. And that includes not only, of course, industrial subsidies, but also agricultural subsidies as well. And well, we are trying to make our bit in the area of fishery subsidies. So this is clearly an important topic. And these things are connected, I think. And focusing in these aspects, I think, hopefully in the upcoming year, will be critical to sort of have the WTO evolve in a way in which we think can underpin the global trading system in the years to come.
Great. I think you have outlined quite a few prospects that WTO can really reach its low-hanging fruit, and we can really get this more convincing success, so we can really see WTO is in action, WTO is reviving, and WTO is making impact, so that all the countries can rally under WTO again, and we can really talk through WTO and busy building up economic lines rather than security lines. So that'd be really great. So Arancha, you've been at WTO for many years, and also from a major European country. What's your think of the future WTO and the reform and how we go from here?
Well, I started with this analogy on a wedding anniversary, because I think the image is a powerful one of what we need to see. I certainly, to continue the conversation that Ambassador Yi started, I would not suggest divorce. I don't think that separating, decoupling, disengaging, trying to go along, moving unilateral will achieve the outcome that WTO engagement can provide. WTO engagement can provide win-win outcomes. Disengagement will provide lose-lose outcomes. It will not provide a win-lose where some win and some lose. Everybody would be worse off. So the first thing we need to see, probably to take this conversation forward, is a change in the attitude, is a change in the understanding of what will happen if we do not engage. And it will certainly be bleaker for every WTO member. And I think this is the starting point of the conversation that then needs to materialize. Like in a normal relationship, you need to nurture this relationship, and you have to nurture it not just with words. Words matter a lot. So this change in attitude is important in the words, but we also have to see a change in the attitude in the deeds. And I think Anabel has very clearly outlined where we have low-hanging fruits, where we can show, where members of the WTO can show that they are ready to look for win-win deal. A very easy one to achieve a win-win outcome would be a deal on fish subsidies. It's why? Because this is not a commercial issue. This is a sustainability issue that matters for all WTO members. is one of a global common good. So it's not about my fish or your fish. It's about whether or not we have fish in the ocean. So starting with a good outcome on an agreement on fishery subsidies would send a very strong signal that countries are ready that they have understood that win-win outcome is a preferred solution. Now, obviously, this should not be the only outcome. I think Anabel has outlined very well where else there are areas for delivery at the next ministerial conference, but also I think the next ministerial conference should set out a very clear agenda for what happens next with a good doses between agreements and also institutional reform that would send this very strong signal that countries are serious, have taken seriously nurturing the possibility of win-win outcomes, which is what we have ahead of us. And again, let me stress, there is no such thing as win-lose. Either it's win-win or it's going to be lose-lose. And this is the choice that members would have to remember when they move into the next ministerial conference of the WTO.
Thank you. Absolutely. It has to be win-win. Otherwise, we'll be lose-lose. It's nobody's really getting out of this, as obvious winner if we do not cooperate. So it's really such a simple argument. I think absolutely right. And again, I personally think WTO needs to really show its effectiveness and demonstrate leadership, particularly among its major players. So Alan, you've been an old hand on WTO for many years, and you know the situation quite well. And it was happened. Normally, as you mentioned, the trade should be a peace stabilizer. As Lamy said, trade should be a peace promoter. Now we see trade getting into the war. Unfortunately, President Trump started this trade war with China, and then we are getting into this kind of still felt in the impact of that. But you can see also President Trump put out of it TPP, CPTPP, and China is really open. China wants to join CPTPP, and China Ministry of Commerce has put its TPP agreement on its website, to see here's the standard. Let's work for that. So I know that you've been quite supportive of TPP, and then what do you think of how can we use those RTA to really regional free trade agreement? How do we can really use that to stimulate the WTO reform? Otherwise, we see a proliferation of all this regional trade agreement, and WTO still stand still, and we can't move forward. So how do you think countries like US and EU and China and all can we work together? We really have to work together, and to see this WTO going forward. Perhaps you can share your wisdom again, Alan, please.
Okay, thank you. There is no substitute for actually getting to some degree of agreement on various subjects. So at the COP26, there was a multilateral effect pushing things forward. There's also the US and China came up with a bilateral agreement that was in aid of COP26, in aid of the Paris Accord. In the WTO, it's not impossible to think that the US, for example, on COVID-19, why couldn't the US and China say there should be a TPRM that is special, multilateral TPRM for what's going on in vaccine distribution? Let's all talk about, get more transparency on interference with the components that go into vaccines and their distribution, which is the current hot topic. One would think that there's room for dual leadership in that sort of case, or broader than dual, with the EU as well, and some others. I've always felt that regional agreements can be a laboratory for what comes into the multilateral trading system. CPTPP has a number of provisions the WTO does not. It addresses subjects the WTO does not, rulebook does not. And China's willingness to engage on those subjects, as Xi Jinping said, indicates that it could be a stepping stone back to Geneva. I think also it's imperative that there be recognition of when there is progress in Geneva. Domestic regulation of services has to be brought into the WTO, as well as investment facilitation, other subjects that are plurilateral, and be regularized, be formally acknowledged as active parts of the WTO. Xiao Jun said at the outset of this round, we have to rebuild trust. The only way to rebuild trust is to do things together and do things even unilaterally that are accepted by the others as a positive contribution. That's why I say something like it would be perhaps greeted with cynicism, but having China say, we'll join the pharmaceutical agreement. We'll go to zero on these things. We're very competitive in those products. We can do that. It's an accretion of positive steps. So I think that getting back to the table on the environmental goods agreement, moving the plastics pollution issue forward to a resolution, expanding the information technology agreement, and also I'd say restoring balance to the system. China and India complain about too much flexibility on domestic support for Europe and the United States. Those two participants in the system should be able to say, all right, we can discuss that. We can do that. We'll reduce our flexibilities. And we understand China took on major obligations in this area. So let's discuss how we deal with, as Anabel has said, in agricultural subsidies. So the only way forward is to actually make actual progress. And I think language also matters. When China says, red line, we're a developing country, what others are hearing is not that it deserves some accommodation in some areas of its economy. What they hear is China is not willing to take on its obligations, but China says we are willing to take on obligations consistent with our capacity. So language matters, but deeds matter even more, as Arancha said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, I think that building trust and rebuild trust is absolutely crucial and important. And we're already starting to see some positive progress on this trade service deal. We see this plastic trade, consensus already been built, and also we see that again the trade investment liberalization facilitation is still ongoing, going strong. So let's push for more agreement. Absolutely, we can really get more deeds speak louder than voice. Perhaps, yeah, John, you have some thoughts.
The previous speakers, what you said is very, very important. Arancha will win. We should do that. So for the WTO, finally, everybody wins. That's our objective. And to prepare for the DDG, I think the ministry conference is the highest authority for lawmaking and for decision making. I hope that the frequency of ministerial conference can be done once a year. I heard that somebody has made such a proposal. But on the other hand, we should make a good preparation for future, for the next MC or the next of next to underline. So to push this, I heard that the EU colleagues have made some proposals to organize working groups or task force for particular subject, such as digital economy or e-commerce or COVID-19 pandemic, how to overcome. So if we collect the views, then to overcome, to narrowing the differences, can make the negotiations faster. So Alice mentioned twice, I appreciate that President Xi Jinping mentioned during the recent import-export on the importance, the position China's accession to the WTO 20th, and China is willing to take active approach to join those talks and the reforms. I have learned, and also some local experts, they start to think about those subjects, including climate and trade and the labor rights, and also in investment, their social responsibilities. So all those, I think that are quite positive. And for subsidy, I'm very happy to learn that can be two sides. Both are flexible. From the agriculture subsidy, they need also to reduce their subsidy. And meanwhile, the other part, take industrial subsidy and the agricultural subsidy on the same table to consider those issues, to make the world fair. Personally, I would like to make a proposal. As during my farewell speech, I mentioned the resumption, re-establishment, reiterate the Article 8 of subsidy agreement. It means that it's non-suitable, that the governments can use subsidy to poor regions, to research and development. That's for the national economic development. And for the whole world to achieve UN SDG, they need also to reduce the gap between poor and rich, wealthy economies. So I think Article 8 is still very critical. So I hope that sometime can put on the agenda of the future MC meetings to consider. It's not actionable. Otherwise, just spend time. And meanwhile, I have also personal proposal that's to use more mediation as a vehicle to settle disputes, because the timing is just too long for litigations, formal dispute settlement procedures. For some small economies, some small matters, we need to encourage bilateral consultations or mediations to settle their dispute. And meanwhile, we can, through the DSP, make the settlement of the mediation be enforceable. It's binding on the parties, no matter the form. The form of the dispute is not so important. How to make it faster, prompt, and positive is and the solution is the objective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and a lot of good suggestions, recommendations. I think that is really, the spirit of this discussion tonight. We are seeking common ground. We are trying to make further proposal recommendation, and we are really build up consensus. So absolutely, I think with all of you very senior, current and former WTO senior officials, is really great. We come together and talk about this, taking the occasion of China's 20 years accession to WTO. But also, I mean, I know that US is interested in giving up some patent on vaccine. China's interested in doing that. There's many things WTO can discuss as well. And also now we know that infrastructure become a common public good, and every country felt so strongly. President Xi announced 1.2 trillion, a trillion of infrastructure bill, and the EU just last week announced this European Gateway, 300 billion EU. And of course, China has done this Belt and Road initiative for the last 8 years. So there could be how WTO can facilitate investment on infrastructure, and maybe that many things we could talk into. Now, we got 20 minutes left. We want to get into our Q&A and comment discussion. My staff was alerting me that we have over 100,000 viewers online and watch us from China and elsewhere. And we have a great impact of this discussion, and very constructive. So we have Professor Tu here, but also we have some media people in our conference room right now, and maybe they can have some questions. So Professor Tu, what's your view about the discussion we have, and the comments, the questions you have? But also, you are the dean of WTO Research Institute at UIBE. So why don't you give us some of your comments and a question to our panelists?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining the seminar. I think this is the most professional panel on WTO issues I have ever seen. I have learned a lot from your points, but I just want to raise a question, actually. Maybe to Alan. To my understanding, the current stalemate of the WTO is basically like this. For China, the United States should stop its damages to the current system, like illegal unilateral tariffs and extreme export controls in the name of national security. In contrast, for the US and also for some other countries, China should agree to make new rules to restrict its state interventions in the future system. But the question is, who should take the first step? Or could the two sides act at the same time in a grand bargain? So this is a question for Alan, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tu. It seems to me that the Airbus dispute went on for 14 or 15 or 16 years, and finally this administration said, well, let's sit down with Brussels, the US and Brussels, and work this out. And they did. They have, this administration has worked out some difficulties with others on, not everyone, on steel and aluminum, and the action taken by the EU in response under what it claimed was a safeguard response. So, what are the areas of opportunity to begin to diffuse tensions? And it may not be the unilateral measures initially. It may be some other area of cooperation. And I don't think, as I said on COP26, there was an area where the US and China could come together and reduce methane emissions. There are areas of common ground. And you have to start with someplace. We were once moving our apartments, and we said, it's too big a chore. We don't know how to move from one apartment to another. And a friend of mine came over and he said, you start rolling the carpet from one end. And we successfully moved apartments as young folks with one of our first apartments. That has to be, I think, how things will be. I don't see a grand bargain immediately, but I think you start with, as Xiaozhen said, trust building, so confidence building measures. Find areas where there can be agreement and begin that process of diffusing tension. And I think it's possible.
Great. So perhaps we have a media representative also on the spot. Maybe if they have questions to ask. we can also take from our floor here in our conference room. So the camera can.
I have a question ask Mr. Li. I want what role do you think China should play in the WTO and its reform? Look ahead, how can China play a further role in WTO reform and the promotion of the trading semester? Thank you. What role do you think China should play in the WTO? Thank you. Yeah. 中国在 WTO 如何发挥更重要的作用？
Well, thank you very much. I think it's an important question because China is no longer a new member. China is 20 years old, it's adult. And I'm pretty sure that China now is playing a very important and key role in all WTO reforms. I can hardly imagine that any meaningful agreement or multilateral agreement can be reached without China's participation, of course, without some other major players, including China. So I fully agree with my colleagues, previous speakers, that China should actively participate in those reforms, and China should take specific steps to show its determination and to lead the negotiations or co-lead negotiations. I fully agree with you. And now we have various initiatives and proposals put on the table in the WTO. And I think China should support all those proposals which are in line with trade liberalization, in line with trade facilitation, and which can strengthen the multilateral cooperation, to strengthen the fundamental multilateral principles like non-discrimination and others. And so to me, I think China can do a lot, but China cannot do it alone. I mean, China has to work together with other major players, with other developing countries. China should also provide some comfort for least developed countries. And so at the end, we can see a balanced outcome of this multilateral reform, and we can see a stronger multilateral trade organization. I think both China and all other WTO members should be part of the solution, not the problem.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more questions from the floor? 现场还有问吗? Maybe Madam Zhang could answer that again.
I just want to add that we need to jointly build up the confidence, trust, and also forward look to work together, cooperation, very important. Now, this moment, the event of China accession to WTO 20 years anniversary is a good opportunity. All universities, all companies, agencies, and ministries, they all have their joint summary conclusions of the past and forward-looking. So they have also put already on the table several proposals I hope that to prepare the incoming MC12, we can build up mutual trust and confidence. I hope that the major media, they should play important role to positively, because when I heard the WTO is bad, no, I said already several years ago that the WTO shall never die, because it's an important contributor to the reduction of the fragmentation of international law. Now it's an important part of international law, very important. Even for regional free trade agreement, they have to follow the WTO principle. So the WTO is still very, very important in international trade, in the global economy. Yeah. So I think I'm confident. So we need to jointly to do more. So thank you also. The CCC is doing excellent job. Even
Thank you.
My first visit.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. We still have many people in the office here. So any further question? If there's one more, okay. 贝杰，有吗？ Minister Yi wants to make a comment. Yeah, okay.
No, I don't have a question, but I want to echo what stated by Anabel about the frequency of ministerial meetings. I think there's a big problem in Geneva. Geneva is delinked with the capital. I mean, Geneva is very much marginalized on those important trade issues. So we need to find a way to reinforce engagement with the ministers and the senior officials. I think Arancha may remember that during intensive negotiations, we had a lot of senior officials meetings, but nowadays, ministers and the senior officials just forgot Geneva. So I guess we need to find a way to engage them. Otherwise, you will keep talking and talking without any delivery. And that's one thing. Another thing is, well, Anabel worked in the World Bank. You know that World Bank and IM, they have 2 ministerial meetings every year. So for WTO, I think it makes no sense to have, to have every 2 years to have one ministerial meeting. I think that's too long and too slow. I mean, you will get behind the trade agenda. So one year, one ministerial. I think that makes sense.
Okay, great. I think we probably come into the end of our discussion, and we have it's going to be 10 p.m. here in Beijing. We still have people in office, attending this great discussion. We had over 100,000 people online to watch this. So maybe to conclude, I really would like to, as a think tank, we always think that. How can we, push the trade liberalization forward? Because we are now in such a dilemma. We are facing geopolitical challenges. We are facing tense relations. But as I think Pascalami said, on the recent China 20 years accession to WTO event in Geneva, or we're here also here in China. We're here tonight with all the senior, current senior, former senior officials of WTO. We all felt that WTO trade, prosperity, and peace stabilizer for the world. I mean, we really have to build up the trade mechanism ever strong, and So maybe to conclude, we each of you maybe have a 1 or 2 minutes to say, what's your hope for the WTO, and what do you think of the most important strengths of WTO, and how we can live through this turmoil, or maybe the challenges that we are facing in the globalization process. The road may be zigzag, but the future is bright. But again, we need to build up trust. We need to work together. We need all the consensus to build. So maybe I'll start with Ambassador Yi to again, we're going to summarize our final words.
Well, one sentence: my dream is to resume the trust between members and reactivate their multilateral cooperation.
Okay, Anabel, and you're currently leading WTO. What's your point? How we can make forward?
So you know that the new year is coming in the Western world, and a little bit after that in China. So I have 5 best wishes for the WTO in 2022. The first one is that we achieve an outcome on trade and health, including on intellectual property, so that the WTO can contribute to sorting out the pandemic. The second one is that we can solidly anchor the discussion on WTO reform, in particular in a topic like subsidies. The third one is that we harvest important negotiations like investment facilitation for development and digital trade. The fourth one is that we can deliver on trade and environment, including on fisheries, but also on the new initiatives that are being launched. And the fifth, and maybe most important one, because it is absolutely necessary to achieve the other 4 wishes, is for leadership and engagement on the part of China and on the part of the larger players, so that we can continue to make a WTO that is stronger, fit for purpose, and that will serve all of its members. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anabel. As also wisely said, all this is really great. I mean, again, you mentioned the 4, not so high-end food, but we have to get there. We have to reach it, but that depends really on the 5th, that we have to exercise strong leadership, both for China, US, EU, and many other countries. So that's great. I mean, we hope that that's the consensus we are having. Actually, we have to, work together, united, and to really make the trade a big peacekeeper, peacemaking for the world. And Arancha, your turn, please. Final words.
My final words is to say that the world is not deglobalizing. The world is re-globalizing. And in this re-globalized world, multilateralism remains the most effective, but also the most legitimate means to manage this new interdependence. So my wish for the new year would be that members of the WTO recommit to make the WTO fit for the purpose of the 21st century. And I hope this to happen next year. Let me, in closing, thank you for the incredible work of putting so many people together to raise awareness, and through this to contribute to building this stronger multilateralism. And let me also congratulate the efforts of the WTO Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, for relentlessly reaching out to all WTO members to get this new spirit of multilateralism moving forward. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Arancha. Yeah, so great. I mean, re-globalize, that's a great word. It's even better than recouple. So let's re-globalize. So we hope that we renew this new season spirit. Let's work together, and that'd be really great message to all of us. So Alan, I mean, you've been to China many times. You've been to CCG before, and we're always good to hear from you. Your final words, please.
Well, I think it's important for the leaders of the major players and actually all the WTO members to emphasize the benefits of trade. It's not just a PR exercise, it's reality. So the Biden administration now has worked very hard to make sure that containers can get past the ports in the United States where there's congestion so that Christmas can be celebrated with presents. And where those presents come from, a lot of them come from China. They certainly come across the Pacific. So it's imperative to point to, as Arancha said, we're living with globalization that is not retreating, it's expanding. That in the pandemic, if you go into a store in the United States and you want to buy masks, there are mask mandates in various places, including the state I live in. Where do those masks come from? They come from China. So there has to be a great awareness of interdependence, which is not harmful. Interdependence is helpful. And in the United States, there's a lot of talk about worker-centric trade policy. And Ngozi Ikonjo-Iweala has talked about the fact that the WTO is about people. And that has to be emphasized and brought home with, as we've all said, deeds as well. So agreements to facilitate the flow of trade. So that's my hope for the new year. Make a good beginning with MC12 whenever it comes about, and come together to make the system work better.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, absolutely. Interdependence. That's really what we need, and also let's work together. So Huiyao, I mean, you are the final words. Very important final words.
I fully agree with what you have said. That we have a good opportunity to watch and to work together. I remember that we joined the WTO Public Forum with Gonzalez, the DG, trade works. I still take this word that trade works even under the pandemic. So I hope that we can overcome the pandemic, COVID-19, and we can get a reunion soon. And since the holiday seasons come, not only in your countries, but also in China. So I wish you Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and also Happy Chinese Lunar New Year.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps Professor Tu, your final word as well? No? Okay. Okay, great. Absolutely. No, we have come to the end of a fascinating discussion. We have 5 senior current and former WTO officials coming from China, US, EU, and also a developing country as well. So we have well represented here. We have a well balanced food for discussion. I think we'll take a lot to digest. We're going to write up a good report on this, and also we have hold this in a very the New Year spirit. Let's really look back, but also look future, even more important, and to resolve our difficulties, and then also to really try to achieve new progress and breakthrough for the WTO. So once again, I want to thank Anabel Gazinoli, Deputy Director General of WTO, and also Arancha Gonzalez Laya, former Foreign Minister of Spain, Alan Wolff, distinguished visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute, but also former Deputy Director General of WTO, and Yi Xiaozhun, former Deputy Director General of WTO, former Vice Minister of Commerce, and Zhang Yuejiao, Dean of the Institute of International Dispute Settlement, Tsinghua University, former Chairperson of the WTO Appellate Body. My name is Henry Huiyao Wang. I'm the President and founder of the Center for China and Globalization. Once again, I want to thank all of you, our distinguished panelists, and our co-organizer from Mr. Tu, and also Minister Yi network. And also we appreciate your time joining us from all parts of the world. And also we appreciate over 100,000 viewers online watching us tonight. Thank you all very much. We hope to see you again next time. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy holidays.